Good day. In my previous program, I spoke about a deteriorating situation for Ukraine. On the battlefronts, I said that there'd been information that the village of Veseloye had been captured by the Russians. This, by the way, was subsequently confirmed by the Russian Ministry of Defense. And I spoke about how there appeared to be a collapsing situation in the bridgehead in Krynky on the east bank of the Dnieper River, and reports of further Russian advances in the Avdiivka, Marinka, and Bakhmut areas. Well, today we've got a cascade of further news, and all of it appears to confirm every one of these trends. Now, let's begin with Krynky, this being the bridgehead across the Dnieper River. There's been a report about the situation in Krynky from, of all places, the Financial Times. This is clearly written before the recent events, but it gives us a sense of how bad the situation in Krynky has been for a long time, and the fact that the Ukrainians have entirely failed to achieve their objectives in this area on the east bank of the Dnieper River. Now, I'm just going to read the first part of this report from the Financial Times. It is not only, or even principally, about Krynky, but it is about Krynky that it begins. So this is what it says. I'm going to tell you the truth, says Vanya, a Ukrainian soldier serving in a reconnaissance unit fighting alongside Marines on the east bank of the Dnieper River in southern Ukraine. The situation is deplorable. His damning assessment follows months of daring raids into enemy territory by Ukrainian forces last autumn to establish a tenuous bridgehead deep in the southern Kherson region. Under the cover of darkness, troops are zipped across the river. I find that kind of language, by the way, inappropriate in discussing these sort of military operations, but never mind. Under cover of darkness, troops are zipped across the river to inflict damage on Russian units and provide one of the few bright spots since Ukraine's much vaunted summer counteroffensive ended in failure. Note again, the word defeat nowhere appears. And then it goes on to say this is the Financial Times. But the unit's grip of the Dnieper foothold near the village of Krynky, it's not near the village of Krynky, it is in the village of Krynky, is slipping. Their positions on marshy terrain and in old enemy trenches are shallow and prone to flooding or filled with the rotting corpses of Russian fighters. Now, again, I have to say straight away that every single report I've read up to this point about the battle in Krynky speaks about the rotting corpses of Ukrainian soldiers, but this article in the Financial Times has said that it's Russian soldiers. I've no doubt that it is Ukrainian soldiers. I don't believe that every other report was wrong. Most of the other reports actually quoted Ukrainian soldiers actually saying that it was Ukrainian soldiers whose bodies were rotting. But never mind, let's press on. Freezing cold temperatures also bite, slowing down operations and making it impossible to rest. Ukrainian troops are suffering heavy casualties here, laments Vanya, declining to give specifics, citing military secrecy. The Russians, he adds, have an advantage of at least 4 or 5 soldiers for every Ukrainian. Part of the problem is logistical, because the Ukrainians must cross the river in small vessels to remain undetected and more nimble. They are not able to transport larger, more deadly weapons. Everything we take is what we can carry ourselves, Vanya says. There are at most some types of grenade launchers. In a very rare case, I saw one heavy machine gun brought across. And then there's a map, and then the article goes on to say the end goal was to create a position from which the Ukrainian army could launch new attacks deeper into Russian-controlled territory. So there it was. It was a foothold. It was a bridgehead, not to be retained in and of itself, but for a further advance, ultimately towards the alluring goal, the tempting goal for the Ukrainians, the fixation of the Ukrainian military, which is, of course, Crimea. That is looking less likely by the day, Vanya says. In recent weeks, Russian military bloggers and Western analysts say that Russian forces have retaken some of the positions on the eastern bank. Asked whether Ukraine can hold its base there long term, Vanya was blunt. Of course not, he says. The fact is that the Marine Corps was unable to maintain the pace of the offensive and for sure lost the initiative a long time ago. Vanya now expects the troops to fall back to defensive positions on the Dniepro's western bank, or the Dniepro's western bank, or risk suffering heavy losses amongst its strongest units. And then the article goes on to discuss other matters. In all essentials, it's exactly the point made by myself in my program yesterday, made by others, most eloquently perhaps by Brian Beletic at the new Atlas. This was a harebrained scheme, an attempt to march on towards Crimea and the Black Sea by landing troops on the east bank of the Dnieper River, creating a bridgehead, launching some kind of offensive operation against the Russians in this area, disregarding the massive Russian fortified lines, the minefields, which the Russians undoubtedly have created, none of which, by the way, have been reached. The Ukrainians have never been able to push beyond Krynky. Their attempts to advance further, deeper into Kherson region, mean that they have again failed to move beyond the zone of control ahead of the Russian fortifications. They've not even reached the fortifications. And we have here another description of massive losses of Marine brigades, the Ukrainian Marine brigades, being debilitated by an attack that was a failure and which, according to this Ukrainian soldier, who appears to be from some kind of special forces unit, well, the possibility of that advance towards Crimea was lost a long time ago. They lost the initiative, he says, a long time ago, which begs the question of why then they decided to cling on for so much longer. Now, there is an interesting fact about this Battle of Krynky, which is that it's been extensively reported by the Russians. It's actually been, for once, extensively and on balance reasonably accurately reported by the Western media. But I've noticed that the Telegram channels, the Ukrainian Telegram channels, which seem to be close to the Ukrainian General Staff, to General Zaluzhny, have generally avoided discussing the situation in Krynky. And that, to my mind, confirms that Zaluzhny is very nervous, or the people on the General Staff, the Ukrainian General Staff, are very nervous about criticizing the Krynky operation, because it was indeed one that the Ukrainians agreed to in consultation with the Americans and British, as I recall, in that meeting between General Milley and Admiral Radakin and General Zaluzhny some months ago. So Zaluzhny doesn't want to criticize a scheme that he agreed and the Ukrainians agreed with the Anglo-Americans. That's my guess. Obviously, I have no concrete confirmation of this, but it seems to me logical. Anyway, what is actually happening in Krynky? Well, there are said to be around 80 Ukrainian troops still clinging on in various parts of Krynky. Now, Dima at the Military Summary channel suggests that they've largely pulled back to, to the shoreline. At least that was my understanding of what he said. There's little in the way of direct confirmation of this. But it's clear that this bridgehead has become untenable and that it is collapsing. And there was a report that, and this is, I seem to remember that it originally came from Rybar, that as the Russians moved deeper into Krynky, into the area of the bridgehead, they were targeted by Ukrainian operators, FPV operators, and artillery from the West Bank, and they suffered losses and had to retreat. But Rybar also went on to say that the Russians, in effect, are now able to enter any part of the bridgehead that they wish, and whatever problems they encounter are not coming from the Ukrainian soldiers in the bridgehead itself so much as from their comrades on the west bank of the Dnieper River. And of course, Vanya, this soldier that the Financial Times has questioned, he basically admits that the Ukrainians are going to have to abandon this bridgehead. And as I said, he was probably saying this. In fact, he almost certainly said this in advance of the latest events, that they're going to have to abandon this bridgehead and pull back to the west bank of the Dnieper and go over to the defensive. Because this operation has been a disaster for them. So, there we are. Situation in Krynky, very bad. Now, I said at the start of this program that the Russian Ministry of Defense has confirmed the capture of ETHEREUM. And Rybar, again, was, I think, the first Russian commentator or reporter. Rybar is, of course, actually a collective, apparently, of reporters. But anyway, Rybar were the first to say that ETHEREUM had been captured. They were making that claim even as other Russian reporters were saying that the Russians had reached the outskirts of ETHEREUM and were preparing to attack the village. And then the Ministry of Defense came out and confirmed that ETHEREUM had indeed been captured. And it's now acknowledged that the Russians had in fact been in physical possession of ETHEREUM for some time, several days perhaps, so that all of these reports about battles around ETHEREUM and the Russians working to surround the village and preparing the ground for an attack on that village, all of those reports that we were getting both from Russian and Ukrainian channels, it seems, were actually inaccurate in that they were reporting events that had happened several days before they were actually reported. And this goes back to a point I made a couple of videos ago. We have to be careful with some of these reports and also some of these pictures and films we see of FPV drones carrying out attacks on the forces of either side. We don't always know when these events actually took place, and quite often, at least, it seems that these pictures might be already historic in terms of the actual developments on the battlefronts. And I say that because Rybar has been at it again, and this Rybar does seem to have some sources within, I suspect, Russian military, probably frontline soldiers, who knows. But anyway, they are reporting that the Russians have now reached and in fact occupied two roads within Avdiivka itself, and that they've captured various houses on the eastern parts of Avdiivka, crossing territory which again many other reporters, Russian commentators, Ukrainian commentators have assumed was still under Ukrainian control, but which, if we accept Rebar's report as true, it looks like was not the case, and that this territory was in fact, has been again under Russian control for some time. Now, my overall impression is that, again, the Russian attacks on Avdiivka are intensifying. There's been some admissions from some Ukrainian channels that, in fact, the Russians are, in fact, advancing within Avdiivka itself. There are also reports that the Russians are continuing to put pressure and are advancing in the Stepovoye area and along the railway line to the northwest of Avdiivka, and are advancing near the famous or infamous coke plant. So lots of reports coming through, some reports again saying that the Ukrainians are preparing to retreat in the area of the village of Stepovoye to the adjoining village of Berdichi, that they're finally accepting that Stepovoye itself has to be once and for all abandoned. Well, who's to say? I mean, it's not always easy to get a clear picture of what's going on in this complex battle, but it is clear that Avdiivka itself is being heavily shelled and heavily bombed by the Russian military. Russian aircraft are active over Avdiivka now, pretty much every day. And given that the number of Ukrainian troops in Avdiivka is probably not that large, one brigade, the 110th Brigade, seems to be responsible for the defense of the town itself. It seems to me that if the Russians do decide to storm Avdiivka over the next couple of days or weeks, the odds of the Ukrainians holding on will begin to become, the odds will start to become increasingly stacked against them. And this pattern is repeating itself now all across the front lines. There's been more reports from the Marinka area. Less now about Novomikhailivka, that all of the indications are that the Russians are now working steadily towards encirclement of Novomikhailivka. This is this strategically located village to the south of Marinka. But the Russians also seem to be making further advances through Georgievka, which is now clearly contested. There's clearly fighting going on in this village, and the Russians again pushing steadily towards Kurakhovo. Again, we're not talking about huge advances. Russians perhaps advancing a couple of 100 meters at a time. But the progress, though it is slow, is steady and incremental, and it pushes slowly, steadily towards this other place, Kurakhovo, which is apparently at the hub of the various transport and communication links, which bind together Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass, including in the important fortress town of Vuhledar, further south. So a deteriorating picture there, and a deteriorating picture in Bakhmut. And again, it's not always easy to get clear what the precise situation is, but all of the reports taken together appear to show further Russian advances, or perhaps I should say consolidation of ground west northwest of Bakhmut as the Russians tightened their grip on Bogdanovka, on the tree lines and fields and dacha communities and whatever it is, west of Bakhmut itself, as gradually, slowly, incrementally, they work their way towards a possible attack on Chasov Yar and work their way towards the railway. And perhaps more news today, more dramatic news today, a reactivation of the Russian offensive in the Kupiansk area, this time not so much focused on Sinkovka, this village west of Kupiansk, which is apparently on high ground, and which the Russians have attacked on several occasions, but never fully captured, though there are reports that the Russians are now gradually working their way round Sinkovka, capturing ground and territory to the north of it. But apparently a major Russian advance immediately south of this area towards the Oskol River. Apparently large numbers of troops involved, an attack on a broad front, and with Kharmov 52 helicopter gunships apparently participating in this advance towards the Oskol River, immediately south of Kupiansk. So, major battles on every part of the front lines, and in every part of the front lines, the Russians steadily advancing. Now, this is the overall picture on the battlefronts. It's important, again, to repeat that the total number of forces, the aggregate number of forces that the Russians have committed to this winter advance is relatively small relative to the overall size of the armed forces that they are gathering just behind the contact line. We are seeing attacks being carried out, mostly in company strength. The only area, it seems to me, where one can say definitely that there is a major Russian commitment to force, probably 40,000 men in total, is around Avdiivka. And these, by the way, are troops principally drawn, or so it seems, from the former Donbass militia, reconstituted into regular units of the Russian armed forces. And around Avdiivka, it does seem to me that the Russians are making a serious effort now to capture this town, as in fact they've been doing since October. It's a tough, careful battle, but there is no doubt at all, or so it seems to me, that the Russians continue to make progress. Now, there is a further point that I am going to make, which is that we see that the Russians sometimes are prepared to push forward in one place, then when they encounter resistance, they will change the axis of their advance and will shift and attack in another direction. They engage in a great deal of thrust and parry. They play a kind of complex game of checkers as they move towards capture of particular Ukrainian fortified positions. They never, so far as I can see, over invest in any particular attack in any particular place. And contrast that with what has happened in Krynky, where the Ukrainians landed a force on the east bank of the Dnieper River, found very quickly that the Russians were able to blockade it, and that the men who were being sent to Krynky were suffering appalling losses. But nonetheless, instead of pulling the troops back from Krynky, accepting that this operation was not going to plan, went on investing, reinforcing failure. It is not something that, generally speaking, the Russians do. And again, I am going to suggest that this points to a fundamental difference in not just military philosophy, but perhaps in professionalism between the high command of the two armies. The people who are conducting the war on the Russian side are absolute professionals. They're not perhaps geniuses at war. There's no Napoleon commanding things on the Russian side, but the men who are running things know their job, and they know how to conduct it. In the case of Ukraine, one does get the sense that a lot of the decision making about how to conduct the war is being made by people who one can best describe as amateurs, which is why, as amateurs often do, they have this habit of reinforcing failure. Now, going back to that Financial Times article, there is a very long discussion about how Ukraine is supposedly now going to go onto active defense, that there is long talk about the fact that Ukraine, having suffered what even the Financial Times admits are staggering losses, how even with the dwindling of military supplies from the West, Ukraine can still somehow keep going, whereby by fighting on, but fighting on some kind of active defense, hoping eventually, presumably, that this will wear the Russians down. Now, I should say that I consider this to be a fantastic idea. Brian Beletic, again at the New Atlas, has explained why this is simply not a viable option now. And I would say that it is also the case that in this Financial Times article, it is not uncontested. There are some Ukrainians who are saying that this defensive strategy would be a major mistake. And it quotes Andrei Zagorodnyuk, a former defense minister of Ukraine. He says that focusing on containment with no offensive component would be a mistake of historic proportions. Without Ukraine continuing to launch offensives, Putin, by which they mean, of course, Russia, would be projecting around the world that the war is unwinnable for Ukraine, and it basically just hands him the initiative. And for that reason, Zagorodnyuk adds, keeping Russia on its toes is essential. So some people in Ukraine are not really happy with this defensive strategy. And, well, Brian Beletic has discussed at length why he thinks that the resources that Ukraine has simply don't make this a viable option for the Ukrainians. And I agree. I would say that we've now had a commentary from the Russians which gives us an idea of how massive the fortified lines that the Russians created in the autumn and winter and spring of late 2022, early 2023, in advance of Ukraine's offensive, how huge that commitment was. And this comes from an article in Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, which is the newspaper of the Russian military. And it comes from an interview provided to Krasnaya Zvezda by Lieutenant General Yuri Stavitsky, who is the head of Russia's engineering troops. And this is what TASS reports this interview. The system of 120-kilometer deep defensive lines increased the survivability of Russian troops in Ukraine 5 to 6 times. In 8 months, over 400 battalion defense lines, defense areas were built, which is an unprecedented achievement. A highly echeloned 120-kilometer deep system of defense lines, positions, and areas was prepared by the beginning of the Ukrainian counteroffensive along the whole contact line. Due to the scope and time of the mission, it was an unprecedented development in the history of wars and armed conflicts. The completely fortified lines, positions, and areas increased the survivability of troops and the engagement effectiveness of arms and hardware 5 to 6 times. Over 3,600 kilometers of trenches, 150,000 dugouts and hardware shelters, over 45,000 bunkers, and 12,000 reinforced concrete structures were made by the beginning of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Over 400 battalion defensive areas were built in 8 months in difficult weather and climatic conditions and in incessant combat actions and massive hostile engagement of precision weapons and drones. The system of defensive lines, positions, and areas included 2 to 3 defensive lines. To compare, this is all quoting Stavitsky, the 135-kilometer Mannerheim line, that's the one between Finland and the Soviet Union, which was important during the Winter War of 1939 and 40 between Finland and the Soviet Union. The 135-kilometer Mannerheim line was built in 10 years. The 400-kilometer long Maginot line was built in 12 years. Well, I'm not sure how exactly these fortified lines that the Russians created actually compare with the Mannerheim line and the Maginot line and all of those. But suffice to say, we are talking about a colossal construction and engineering accomplishment. I mean, this is something done on a huge scale. And I heard that the actual designer of this project was a man called General Romanchuk, who is apparently the person who's written the manual on how to build, construct defensive lines of this kind. He, rather than General Surovikin, was the true architect of this colossal feat, operation, and it seems that General Stavitsky, Lieutenant General Stavitsky, essentially acted as his chief engineer. And notice that Stavitsky doesn't mention in this discussion these vast minefields that the Russians constructed, which caused the Ukrainians so much trouble over the course of their offensive, and which many people in the West blame for the offensive's failure. So, a defense system built by the Russians over a period of 8 months on a simply humongous scale, which is 120 kilometers deep. Is it realistic to believe that Ukraine is going to be able to duplicate that to anything like the necessary degree? I can't see this. The Russians have control of the air. I know some people hope that the F-16s will change that, but I don't think that is at all likely, and I don't think anybody seriously, who really knows about these things, seriously expects that will happen. The Russians have vast artillery stocks. The Ukrainians launched their summer offensive with, well, perhaps 500,000 shells. The Russians, according to an authoritative source who has communicated with me privately, says that the Russians have stockpiled around 1 million shells in just one part of the contact line. Just saying. The Russians are producing more and more tanks, armored vehicles, types of equipment. And even Zelensky now is admitting that things are not going well on the armaments and ammunition front. He's just he's just been speaking. Apparently, he said this in Davos. And I have this quote from him. This is from apparently a news conference he gave in Davos, which has been posted by his office on YouTube, that Kiev is facing shortages. And he said, artillery, for example, 155 caliber, the whole world, the production of all the companies that generate the production of 155 caliber artillery shells is not enough to sustain a war with artillery in Ukraine. There is not enough production in the world today, using artillery as an example, enough for the Ukrainian army to withstand a war against the Russian army. And then, interestingly, he said that Kiev is lacking drones and shells, and that there is a deficit to achieve certain goals that we are working towards. And there's also been another quote from Ukraine's Minister of Strategic Industries, Alexander Kamyshin. He was talking apparently last week. He says that we will be weak on the battlefield. We will have a big shortage of artillery. We will not be able to repel ballistic missile strikes. There will be a large number of killed and wounded people. There will be a big crisis for the whole Europe. Without help from the United States and the European Union, Ukraine will struggle, will be weaker, and Russia will have the opportunity to take us over. Well, there we are. That's Zelensky and his industries minister. At least that's my understanding of this, of what they said. So, given this overwhelming preponderance that the Russians are building, is it realistic to believe that Ukraine can win this war now by going on the defensive? I agree with ex-defense minister Zagorodnyuk that in fact it would mean surrendering the initiative to the Russians. Though not in the sense that he means, not in the sense that the world would take away the view that the war is unwinnable for Ukraine, though most of the world probably would think that, and probably already does. A static defense behind what are not going to be fortified lines in any way comparable to the Russian lines, by a force that has been severely ground down and weakened by the Russians over the course of 2 years now of war, is going to, if it goes on to the defensive in the way that is being suggested, it is going to cede the operational initiative on the battlefield to the Russians. What it will mean is that the Russians will be able to pick and choose where to attack, commit overwhelming force to that particular place, and be able to punch further holes through the Ukrainian defenses, causing massive damage to Ukraine. Now, way back in August, whilst the Ukrainian offensive was underway, George Beebe and Jim Webb discussed Ukrainian tactics at that time. And they suggested that it made sense for Ukraine to call off the offensive, go on the defensive, and initiate talks with the Russians. And I agree. I think that is exactly what the Ukrainians should have done then. In fact, I am going to say that I think the right thing for the Ukrainians to have done and for the Western powers to have done was to do what General Milley, in one of those mumbled contradictory statements that he was occasionally making, which he didn't really mean, but anyway, he did say back in the autumn of 2022 that the war had reached the point where Ukraine needed to start negotiations. The Ukrainians had made some gains in Kharkiv and Kherson region, but they'd probably reached the limit of what they could realistically do, and it was time, therefore, to sit down and talk. And if Ukraine had done that, if they'd used the winter of 2022 to do what is now being suggested, build up their fortifications, if the Western powers had used the time and funding that was available at that time to reinforce the Ukrainian army, to give them the equipment, to strengthen and complete those fortifications, well, they could have held off the Russians, perhaps. For a longer period, the Russians very far at that time from being in a position to launch a major offensive. And that would, of course, have allowed an opportunity for negotiations. But of course, that was not what was done. There was a decision made instead to go for victory, to launch the offensive in the summer, and the rest is history. And we are now where we are. Let me repeat a point I have made before. George Beebe and Jim Webb, back in the summer, suggested that Ukraine go on the defensive and begin negotiations. Ukraine simply going on the offensive and not undertaking negotiations is a losing strategy. It is not one that Western publics will indefinitely support. It smacks too much of a strategy to create a forever war, and it is not, or so it seems to me, logistically and industrially viable. Now, there have been other small things that have been happening. There's been lots of reports now about how the Russians are about to massively upgrade their drone forces, that they're apparently working to integrate AI technology into their FPV drones so that the drone operators have less to do, which we will see. There's also reports about how the Russians are now producing many, many more jammers to counter Ukrainian FPV drones. I'm not an expert in these matters, and I'm going to leave that kind of thing for others to talk about. They can do so far more eruditely than I can do. But I noticed that at Davos, at the World Economic Forum at Davos, the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, came along and again spoke out against negotiations. He again essentially spoke out about the need for the West to go on supporting Ukraine until final victory is achieved. He trotted out, once again, Neville Chamberlain and Munich and appeasement, and said that appeasement of dictators, meaning Putin, of course, is unwise and cannot be countenanced. And as far as I can see, given that the British government apparently has run out of military equipment to send to Ukraine, all that it can now do is work overtime to prevent negotiations to settle the war from happening. That seems now to be the British political priority. So there was a lot of discussion about the fact that Rishi Sunak visited Kiev and gave the Ukrainians £2.5 billion of British taxpayers' money, which, to be frank, is not going to make much difference to their catastrophic budgetary situation, but never mind. He also signed a security document with Ukraine. The British, a few weeks before, had pledged to provide Ukraine with 2 minesweepers, warships to clear mines in the Black Sea. As Alex Christoforou and I predicted on the Duran, the Turks ensured that those 2 ships never reached the Black Sea. They said that doing so, allowing them to transit into the Black Sea, would violate the terms of the Montreux Convention, and they've been impounded in Turkey, which, by the way, subsequently, reports from Britain said that the British understood would happen. All of these gestures, all of these continued expressions of support for Ukraine are clearly intended by the British government to support this policy now, which appears to be the only policy that the British government has with respect towards the war in Ukraine, which is to try to stop any mechanism towards a negotiated peace. And unfortunately, this tactic has its supporters in other Western governments, and it is succeeding. Now, Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, gave a massive news conference, had just given a massive news conference. It lasted 3 hours. He was in I thought, a rather confident mood. He spoke about how Russia is gradually achieving its independence from the West, how it's been in some respects liberated by the severance of the relationships with the West, though he was careful to make clear that this was not an outcome that the Russians had ever sought. But anyway, that is where we are. So Lavrov was talking about all of that. He went out of his way to say, as I discussed in my program yesterday, that the Russians no longer trust the West, but he essentially dismissed all talk about negotiations between Russia and Ukraine or between Russia and the Western powers. He said that all we're getting are rumors. No real negotiations are taking place. There's stories circulating about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia starting in Geneva. He said these are just rumors. There's no substance to them. And I think this is true. And Lavrov also again reiterated that the Russians will work to achieve all the objectives of their special military operation. And he also said that Russia remains open to negotiations, always has been, but that neither the Ukrainians nor the West show any genuine interest in them. My own sense is that a couple of months ago, there was serious consideration in the West of trying to negotiate with the Russians some kind of freezing of the conflict after the Ukrainian offensive failed. Too many forces in the West were adamantly opposed to that idea. The Ukrainians themselves were adamantly opposed to that idea. So even that proposal for a freezing of the conflict, which of course the Russians rejected, has now basically been dropped. And instead we see that the war goes on with this fantasy now, replacing the fantasy of an advance on Crimea from the Krynky bridgehead, the new fantasy is of Ukraine going over to active defense, hunkering down and keeping the Russians at bay. Until, well, who knows what happens. It's an exhaustion of ideas that is remarkable, and it is very dangerous. President Putin's deputy, Dmitry Medvedev, the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, and the man who heads the Military Industrial Commission, which supervises the work of Russia's military industrial complex, he's now written another message. And perhaps it goes further than any other statement by any other Russian official up to this point in casting doubt on the future of Ukraine as an independent state. Now, Medvedev has, on numerous occasions now, made clear that the minimum condition for peace is regime change in Kiev. So this has obviously gone beyond things that Putin himself has said, but now Medvedev has gone even further than that. He's no longer just talking about regime change. He is actually saying that the mere existence of an independent, separate Ukrainian state, and he is talking more about a separate Ukrainian state rather than an independent Ukrainian state, as I understand it. He says that the Ukrainian state is artificial. It is dividing the Eastern Slavs, the Russian people, from each other. He has taken up President Putin's formulation that Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians are a triune, a unity. They come together and make up a single people, which is the Russian people. He says that having a separate state like Ukraine all but guarantees that that separate state will become anti-Russian because it is artificial and it needs to be anti-Russian in order to exist at all, because that is the only way it can justify its existence, given that it is in effect dividing the larger Russian people from each other. And it is therefore always going to be a danger to Russia, and it is going to be a danger to Ukrainians themselves, because it will always lead them into a conflict with Russia, which, as the current conflict shows, has been disastrous for the people of Ukraine. Now, if you follow that logic, you arrive at the inevitable endpoint, which is that there should not be a separate state for Ukraine. There should not, in other words, be an independent Ukraine. Now, I understand that there is another intelligence assessment circulating in Washington, which again says that President Putin supposedly has not retreated from his initial objectives, which is the total conquest and subjugation of Ukraine. I want to make it absolutely clear, I see no evidence that President Putin had such an objective before the start of the special military operation in February 2022. On the contrary, he worked very hard, or so it seems to me, to establish good relations with Ukrainian leaders, Leonid Kuchma and Viktor Yanukovych, and by the way, Yulia Tymoshenko. He also, of course, brokered the Minsk I and Minsk II agreements. He spent a huge amount of time trying to find ways to engineer some kind of peace settlement in Ukraine, none of which seems to me compatible or consistent with a project to subjugate and take control of Ukraine. And of course, when the special military operation began, he still appeared to limit himself to very limited objectives. He sat down, or at least he got his negotiators to sit down with Ukrainian negotiators in Belarus and then in Istanbul, and they came away with a draft agreement, which we're told by one of the Ukrainian negotiators, Mr. Charlie, that he himself endorsed, a draft agreement which would not only have preserved independent Ukraine, but which would have accepted that Ukraine was not in a position at that time to recognize de jure the independence of the two Donbass republics or the fact that Crimea was part of Russia. That was supposed to be postponed, that decision was supposed to be postponed until negotiations had found a way to resolve it over a period of 10 to 15 years. The only key requirement that Putin was making over the course of that negotiation was that Ukraine commit never to join NATO and never to allow NATO troops to establish bases in Ukraine itself, with a Russian veto on the deployment of such troops on the territory of Ukraine. So none of that is consistent to me with President Putin up to that time seeking to destroy Ukraine and to reabsorb it into Russia. But with every day that passes, we see how that outcome becomes more likely. And we see how former President Medvedev, as I said, now the vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, is now openly advocating for it. And I am sure that he is not the only person doing that. Now, recently we did a program on the Duran, Glenn Deason, and myself with Professor Jeff Roberts, British historian, written outstanding books on Stalin and on the Soviet policy and the conduct of the Second World War and on many other matters. And we discussed the evolution of Soviet policy in Ukraine, and we also discussed Putin's own objectives. And Jeff Roberts, by the way, has also written a most interesting paper. It's not easy to find, so I'm going to provide a link at the bottom of this program, in which he discusses the many myths that have clouded understanding about Russia and its intentions and about the Ukrainian war in general. But over the course of that program, we discussed how initially Russian objectives in Ukraine, Putin's objectives in Ukraine, were limited. We also discussed at least the possibility that President Putin might still be willing to negotiate for terms which, though far harsher than the terms that he agreed in Istanbul back in March and April 2022, might have allowed an independent Ukrainian state, or would have allowed an independent Ukrainian state to survive and even prosper. But with every day that passes, President Putin's own opinions are probably hardening, and other officials and political leaders in Russia, their opinions are hardening also. And we see that Medvedev, who is clearly positioning himself as the public voice of these hardliners, is now straightforwardly coming forward and saying, look, this experiment of an independent Ukrainian state has been a complete disaster, a disaster for us in Russia, for the Ukrainians as well, and it's time to bring it to an end. Now, there are times when I do wonder whether there aren't some people in the West who aren't aware at some level of this evolution in Russian thinking and who don't almost want to see this as the outcome of the war. They've probably by now come to realize that the original objective of undermining Russia, weakening Russia, engineering regime change in Moscow is unattainable. But they are perhaps saying to themselves, well, look, if we can't achieve that, let's at least create a situation where the people of Europe are divided from Russia indefinitely, where the Russians are pushed into absorbing the entirety of Ukraine with all the many problems that will go with that. And, well, that will suit us better because it will work to our narrative of an imperialistic, aggressive Russia. And there are now all kinds of articles starting to appear about how that outcome might be an outcome of the war. There was an article in Bloomberg which said that Russia can't be allowed to win the war because if it does, it's going to have the most powerful armed forces in the world. It's going to be a militaristic, revisionist, dangerous state with a vast number of people who have military experience and military knowledge, and it'll be a permanent threat to the West. Well, that is perhaps an outcome that some people in the West would rather have, rather than actually see peace in Ukraine, because it would be more consistent with their narrative, the one that they have been relentlessly pushing basically ever since President Putin came to power, that Russia is an aggressive, revisionist state. And, well, if Ukraine finally goes down, they'll be able to say, I told you so. Well, all I would say is, if that is the calculation that some people are following, it is beyond cynical. It is profoundly shocking, actually. The damage it does to Ukraine and to the Ukrainian people is beyond estimation. And if the British government, which is, as I said, the most vocal at the moment in rejecting all negotiations, if they're party to this in any way, then I say shame on them. Now, of course, there are other people who continue to cling to different views. Hope, as they say, springs eternal. With some people, that the original objective, regime change in Moscow, collapse in Russia, all of that might be achievable after all. Now, we had a slew of economic news from the Russians. President Putin had a meeting with members of his cabinet, the economic team. There was a very impressive address by the economics minister, Maxim Reshetnikov. I should say that the economics ministry in Russia, as I understand it, was originally built up in the 1990s on the basis of Gosplan, the Soviet Union state planning agency. And there was apparently a transfer of personnel. And anyway, they seem to be in overall charge of the economy alongside the finance ministry to this day. Suffice to say, whether that is the case or not, they do come across to me as very impressive people. Anyway, the overall point was that the economy is strong and doing well. There's been significant rise in industrial production. Manufacturing output grew in 2023 by around 7.3%, very rapid growth. Agricultural output is strong. Living standards throughout 2023 have been rising, and there was general agreement that though for the moment the GDP growth in 2023 is put at 3.5% on the basis of current data, as Rosstat, Russia's state statistical agency, works through the data, that will be revised upward, and that growth, GDP growth in Russia in 2023 was actually closer to 4%. Reshetnikov pointed out that in 2021, growth was 5.9%, not 5.6% as previously assumed. This is, of course, 2021 was the year of the recovery from the pandemic. And in 2022, the contraction, the recession caused by the sanctions shock was 1.2% instead of 2.1% as previously thought. And Reshetnikov also pointed out that with these statistical revisions, the Russian economy is now bigger than it was at a time when the sanctions were imposed in February 2022, with all signs being that growth will continue and that before long, within 3 to 4 years, Russia will overtake Japan and will become the fourth biggest economy in the world, it now being the fifth biggest economy in the world, calculated on purchasing power parity bases. Anyway, that's for another discussion for another day. So, one way or the other, very impressive economic figures coming from the Russians about the performance of their economy in 2023. But of course, as I said, hope springs eternal. So we read, for example, in Bloomberg, and it's been picked up by many people, that oil revenues for Russia were lower at the end of 2023, and currently there's been a dip in oil revenues, partly because, of course, oil prices have fallen, partly also because the Western powers have been trying to tighten up the enforcement of the oil price cap. There's also other articles appearing about how the West the United States again, having tightened up its restrictions on financial transfers to Russia. This has been causing payment problems between Russian suppliers and banks in Turkey and China. And some people putting all this together and saying, well, this Russian growth, it's a flash in the pan. Sooner or later, the sanctions will catch up and we'll start to see real problems for the Russian economy going forward. This has been the leitmotif of Western commentary about Russia ever since the first sanctions were imposed all the way back in 2014. And it never turns out to be true. Yes, undoubtedly, oil revenues have fallen. They sometimes do. It's nothing new. The Russians have to adjust to that regularly. We've seen that happen before, and no doubt it will happen again. Other months, oil revenues will no doubt rise. As the finance ministry has been pointing out, oil revenues now, energy revenues, are making it up, making for a declining share anyway in the Russian budget. And I would add for the record that they are anyway not as great as Westerners periodically imagine. I remember having a long discussion about this with my old friend, John Hellervig, who unfortunately passed away some years ago. He was discussing the real structure of Russia's consolidated budget. I've discussed this in previous programs. And he pointed out that the actual biggest revenue flow to the budget does not come, or did not come at that time, from energy revenues, as Westerners always thought, but from payroll taxes, which is the same as you will find in the West. And anyway, one way or the other, the Russians will overcome whatever blips they get, whatever bumps happen with energy revenues. There was no budget crisis last year, and there isn't going to be one this year either, or the year after. And as for the fact that there have been payment problems with certain banks, this too has happened before, and eventually the Russians and the countries that they work with, China, the UAE, Turkey, whichever, they iron them out. This is a consistent pattern. The attempts, in fact, to create spokes in the wheel of payments, all that it is doing is driving faster the process which the Russians are leading, but which all the BRICS countries have signed up to. Prime Minister Modi of India confirmed as much in a telephone call with President Putin the other day, to create as quickly as possible alternative financial and payment mechanisms to finally and completely circumvent the problems that the West is causing. Now, there are some people who get this. There is a long article in Newsweek by David Rundle, who was a former chief of mission at the American Embassy in Saudi Arabia, and Ambassador Michael Kverler, who is a former political advisor to the US Central Command and who spent 15 years working in the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union. So they've written a joint article for Newsweek. And I'm not going to read this article, it's quite long, but they say how Russia won the sanctions war with the West. And they say quite straightforwardly, all of these plans, all of these schemes, they've achieved nothing. The Russians have, their economy has proved resilient, and they've been able to keep going, and their economy, in fact, if anything, is growing. And let's put aside this idea that sanctions is going to bring the Russian economy down, because it's not going to do so. And they also point out that all these wonder weapons, as they call them, the HIMARS, the Leopards, all of that, they failed to achieve anything on the battlefield, and the diplomacy has failed to isolate Russia, which is busy reviewing numerous applications to join it in the BRICS organization. Economic warfare, they say, has been a bust. And this has led some to now consider the mother of all sanctions. And this mother of all sanctions is stealing, that's the way I'm going to describe it, seizing, if you prefer, the frozen Russian central bank reserves and assets. And they say some foreign policy advisors are now proposing that these assets should be confiscated and handed over to Ukraine. Regardless of its legality, that is a very dumb idea. Taking the assets of Russia's central bank would encourage just about everyone to find an alternative to the dollar, and by the way, the euro, as their reserve currency, and by the way, also teach them to steer clear of the European banks. That won't be easy, but if the alternative is losing all your money, if you annoy Washington, people will find a way. And then they go into further discussions about this. And they say sanctions are cheap and easy to impose, but they seldom work. While they make it look like you're doing something meaningful, they are in fact often little more than economic virtue signaling. Economic sanctions have certainly not changed the outcome in Ukraine. Kiev is out of men, out of money, out of artillery shells, and out of time. The West should stop giving money to a man with a hole in his pocket. Wisdom from two ex-US diplomats. And notice that one of them, David Rundle, is an expert on Saudi Arabia, which is, of course, one of the countries that would be most worried in the event that the West were to go off and start seizing assets. They're already furious about this whole price cap idea that the Western governments have been plugging. And the other, Michael Gferler, Ambassador Gferler, well, he is an expert on the Soviet Union and the former Soviet Union, and he is familiar with these things. So there are some people who get it. There are plenty of people, especially in the United States, who are out there giving the correct advice. But of course, that advice is not being followed and apparently won't be. Now, I'm going to finish this program by now turning actually to Saudi Arabia, because even as the situation in the Middle East continues to deteriorate, and we had a bizarre set of comments from President Biden, who admits that the missile strikes against the Houthis are not going to intimidate or deter them, but says that they must go on anyway, which is, one of the most startling admissions I've ever heard from an American president, and an incredibly belligerent speech from Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has basically said that Israel must retain control of the entire territory of the British Mandate of Palestine indefinitely, and that there must never ever be a Palestinian state. Well, despite all of that going on, and tension, the missile strikes by Iran on Pakistan, the counter-strikes by Pakistan on Iran, all of that, we're now getting more and more reports of a major Saudi peace initiative starting to take form. And my understanding is that the idea is that the Palestinian Authority be acknowledged as basically a Palestinian state, that there should be a recognition that there is a Palestinian state, that there should be a ceasefire in Gaza, that the Palestinian state should be internationally recognized and be provided with a seat in the United Nations, in the General Assembly, and that there should be negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis to achieve a final and full settlement of the crisis between, of the conflict between the Israeli and Palestinian nations. And as part of that process, yes, the Saudis say we would be prepared to agree to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. Now, I am confident that this plan has been coordinated by the Saudis with all their friends, the Russians, the Chinese, the South Africans. Saudi Arabia is either now a member of the BRICS or about to become one. There's some uncertainty about this. I'm sure they've all been working on this plan. I'm sure it was discussed with President Putin when he visited Saudi Arabia and the UAE a few weeks ago. And I have no doubt that when this plan is presented and made public, it will gain overwhelming international support outside the West and the globe, outside the West, and perhaps Israel itself. In fact, definitely Israel itself. Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has made his entire career by setting his face against the establishment of any kind of international Palestinian state, who has relentlessly pursued settlement expansion in the Palestinian territories. Apparently, the Saudi plan requires a freeze on further settlement construction. Anyway, Prime Minister Netanyahu clearly sees this plan as an existential threat, and I've no doubt that this is what explains his recent extraordinary comments about Israel needing to have security control of the whole territory of the former British Mandate of Palestine. He actually used words of formulation which, I should say, has been condemned by some people, in my opinion, inappropriately, when it is being used by supporters of Palestine or the Palestinians to describe, well, to articulate their support. Because of concerns about the sensitivities of this platform, I'm not going to repeat these words. In my opinion, as I said, this is all carefully coordinated amongst the BRIC states and the Arab states. It flows from that meeting that took place of the Arab states in Riyadh a short time ago. It's connected also to the application that South Africa, a BRIC state of course, has brought to the ICJ. We shall see where it goes. But if this proposal is indeed put forward, and if most of the global community backs it, I suspect it will also find a lot of popular support in the United States and in Europe especially. It will make the position of the Biden administration even more difficult than it already is. And with some people in the Biden administration, in my opinion, quite clearly looking instead for a war with Iran, it will make the position of the United States even more open to criticism if it pursues that war instead of supporting this peace plan. Now, we've discussed this issue on a program that we've done on the Duran. I am sure that I will have an awful lot more to say about it, but I'm going to wait until this peace plan finally is published before I do. This is where I end my program today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can please remember to check out our shop where we have all our amazing things, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And I believe we're still running a sale there. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.